Let's go back to New York City in 1945. World War II was over, and a racist dictator had been defeated. But returning soldiers came home to a nation that was still divided along racial lines. In fact, they had fought the war in racially segregated units. The Jim Crow laws that institutionalized racial segregation were still in effect. There were signs all over that said colored and whites only. Public schools, transportation, restrooms, restaurants, and drinking fountains were separated, keeping blacks and whites apart. Blacks listened to black music, and whites listened to white music. But in the early 50s, the division between black and whites started to blur, and at the same time, the music of the two races combined to create a new genre of music called rock and roll. Most music up into the 40s was innocent and non-suggestive or offensive. Famous white artists such as Ruth Wallace wrote songs that combined jazz and swing. Jazz itself was pure African American music that was simply played or composed by whites with almost no change. While whites were playing this black music, meaning jazz, it was not the same exchange that happened in the 50s that created rock and roll. Until the 1940s in the South, African Americans sang mostly songs that were a combination of blues and country. This was passed down by their slave ancestors that would sing while working in the fields. The blues allowed the African Americans to express themselves through music. However, this type of music was not very popular among the people that were white, and largely because of racism and discrimination, most black artists never made an attempt to make a living from it. Then, in the 1940s, a man by the name of Sam Phillips opened the Memphis Recording Service in the South and recorded black rhythm. It was new and many people liked the music, just not the fact that it was coming from someone who was not white. In order to sell more records, many recorders found white men with a, quote, Negro sound and had them make a cover of the song. This introduced a new sound to the white population in such a way that it was more acceptable, and the blues began to spread its influence to other cultures. In general, African Americans wrote their music and would perform it in small, urban centers to an all-black audience, and the white men would perform their music to an all-white group. However, a man named Alan Freed was the exception. In 1951, during his Moondog show, he sped up the blues tempo and aimed his entire show towards black and white teens who made up the audience. It was a cross-current between electric blues, gospel, jazz, boogie, and country. Because the style seemed so new to everyone, he started to call it rock and roll. Elvis Presley was an American rock and roll singer whose fame got its start in the early 50s. He was born in 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi. Here was where he received his first guitar. During his early childhood, he grew up a lot around African Americans, most likely affecting his view towards them. In 1945, his family moved to Memphis, Tennessee. While in Tennessee, he attended the monthly all-night singings on a regular basis that took place downtown. Many of the white gospel groups that were there reflected African American spiritual music. He grew up on black artists and music. This would explain why in his musical career, many of his songs were a mixture of black blues, gospel, and country. He changed the music that he grew up on just enough to call it his own. He fused them together. In fact, one of his first hits, Hound Dog, was first made famous by Big Mama Thornton 3 years before he recorded it. One woman, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, also known as the godmother of rock and roll, was an early influence on Elvis Presley, as well as other rock and roll artists like Chuck Berry, Johnny Cash, and Little Richards. She was an African American gospel singer who often used electric guitar, clearly laying the groundwork for rock and roll. Her performances were also well attended by Caucasians, influencing many soon-to-be artists.
Yes, how it rained. I said it rained, children. Rain, oh yes.
The classic style of the blues was usually played with a piano or saxophone as the lead instrument. But when the electric guitar was invented, it changed the game for so many artists. Elvis Presley was one of these artists that used the electric guitar to great effect. Soon the electric guitar's popularity skyrocketed, and artists started replacing the sax and piano with it. This targeted younger people because of how new it all was. The younger generations enjoyed the upbeat sound. In 1953, Bill Haley and his Comets were the first to be on the top hits list with their rock and roll single, Crazy Man Crazy. More rock and roll hits started to reach the charts, and many independent record labels started to record new artists. Let's listen to a famous rock and roll song by Bill Haley and his Comets called Rock Around the Clock.
We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. Put your glad rags on. Join me, hon. We'll have some fun when the clock strikes one. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight. We're gonna rock, rock, rock till broad daylight. Gonna rock around the clock tonight.
If we break it down, the classic 12-bar blues that the blacks were using in their music is apparent throughout the entire song, but is played in an up-tempo with a very strong beat and a swing-style drumming. Listen again while I count the measures. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and on throughout the entire song. This song is an example of the merging of the two styles. As the two styles merged to create this new genre called rock and roll, so did the two races. In 1956, a musical film called Rock Around the Clock was released. While it stars Bill Haley and his Comets, it also featured a number of black artists, and for a lot of whites, it was the first time they started to see black faces connected with the music they had been listening to. It was as though the world changed suddenly, from monochrome to technicolor. Rock and roll united these two groups. The genre forced record companies that had previously been segregated to sign black artists because the music was so popular and profitable. The fans of rock and roll also found common ground along the line of race. This new music targeted at both black and white. Racism pervaded the culture of the older generation. Yet because of this common ground, whites started to become more tolerant of the African Americans and vice versa.
When this very popular music, black rock and roll, came on the scene, well, these kids started developing their own style of dance. And it wasn't long before, at my school, they would command the entire dance floor, and they were so good and so talented, and they moved so well, and they had such great moves that the white kids would kind of stand back and let them out of the floor and stand there and admire them and wish they could dance as good as them, and eventually trying to mimic them, and asking them, well, how'd you do this, how'd you do that? And all of a sudden the black kids are the best dancers in school. And so that kind of made the white kids admire them. That was one way in which, but that was just one. There was a lot of ways in which kids were overcoming racial prejudice.
Music was the catalyst that brought many of these segregated youth together in common interest. While rock and roll obviously did not fix all racial issues in America, it is very clear that it did help solve many. Many people from the previous generation thought that rock and roll was a passing fad, but much to their surprise, it caught like wildfire and grew exponentially. And with it, so did racial interaction, and the lines between blacks and whites in America continue to blur and fade. Rock and roll turned out not to be a passing fad. Rock and roll was here to stay, and so were steps towards a more racially tolerant society that were swept along with it.